They say African diaspora, like we're a completely different subgroup of Africans, separate from the pure Africans in Africa. And genetics has proven that not to be so true. And it's also proving that upon closer examination through cultural studies, anthropology, just studying the history and making connection with the culture as it is today. You know, get down to the grassroots and touch it today. You know, you realize that um, African culture has always been in a process of um, development, always been evolving, always been splintering off and creating new variants. And so that's just the nature of culture itself, but particularly African culture. And so when it's understood that what we're calling the African diaspora and viewing as like a broken branch of the African family tree, separate and disconnected from the rest of the tree, um, when you examine it through a cultural heritage and a genetic lens, you begin to understand that there never really was a separation of the blood. The blood never stopped existing. The genes never stopped existing. The culture never truly stopped existing. Neither did the language. It just took new form. And it took new form in variation. And it took new form in decentralized environments, environments that were more like prisons, where our people were not free to move around and socialize and meddle and mix with each other. We were very limited in who we could mate with, who we could mingle with, who we could become ultimately as bloodlines in the future. This is one of the greatest aspects of the genocide committed against us in the Mansa, was that they seized our liberty of movement and our selection of mates. Very, very important. If you look at it similar to like a zoo situation, where you might take 10 male gorillas and 10 female gorillas from 20 different local locations, they all belonging to local families in 20 different locations, and you bring them to one zoo. And you bring them to that one zoo, and you begin the process of assimilating them to zoo life. You begin the process of feeding them with your hand. You begin the process of beating them and commanding them and breaking their will to make decisions on their own. And they realize these gates shock them, so they're limited in how they can move. And you leave them in that condition. And you come back a year or 2 years later, and now there's 30 of them. That means there's been some mating. People have been having babies. They've been having natural, normal life within the confines of a zoo environment. And now there's more of them than what there were prior, right? So now you have 30. Now they decide, okay, well, we're going to bring 10 more from 10 different areas into this 30. And so now we have 40. And they continue that process. And they continue that process. And they continue that process. And by emancipation, we find ourselves scattered throughout regions where our ancestors have been confined to plantation life for generations. And we don't know each other. We don't know what happened to Uncle Jim, Cousin Cato, them. We don't know where they took them. But DNA, autosomal DNA testing, is assisting with reconnecting individuals with their biological relatives, with their kinfolk that they would have had no other way of knowing that this is my family, that this is my relative, right? And so it's very important that we consider the genetic aspect when we say, what is the African diaspora? When we sit down to define the African diaspora, what are we talking about genetically? Very, very important. Also, when we're talking about the African diaspora, we're not just talking about existing outside of Africa or merely being physically outside of Africa. The reason is because there's those who have a legal status and a right in Africa that those who were forcefully stolen away and enslaved no longer have or do not have on the continent. One of the biggest aspects of lineage restoration is to reconnect people to families, lands, villages, clans, where they can then begin to restore and redeem their family's lineage on the ground in Africa. Talk about healing. You're talking about generational curses. You're talking about getting back to the root of the problem. That's what I'm talking about. Understanding that the African diaspora can be also understood as being those Africans who were involuntarily taken away from our lands and from our families, and from the continent of Africa by force, and their descendants. And that we as their descendants represent them today. Don't ever let anyone tell you, oh, that was a long time ago, as long as you live, because those genes are inside of you. That biology still exists within you. It's impacted you whether you know it or not. Even if in terms of epigenetics, in terms of generational trauma, even if at that level you have been impacted by what was inflicted on your biological ancestors as someone from the African diaspora, right? And so the African diaspora has a different identity, but again, the African identity is diverse. We collectively, as the African diaspora, are those who are born into countries and under constitutions in the modern days that do not give us a national or a human right on the African continent as a member of the African family. And so while some people are screaming reparations, those of us who are dealing with the African diaspora as an actual entity, as an actual people, right? As actual people with a historic case to be restored, have our families, our lineages restored on the continent, which would imply that we inherit the same rights as every other African on the continent, including citizenship. That we now turn to our African brothers, our African sisters, our cousins, our aunties, them, uncle them, and we begin for plead to them, plead for their understanding, and then plead for them to open the way for the lost sons and daughters of Africa to make a safe return back to the continent, not as a different breed of Africans, not as some broken branch of the family tree, right? But as one of the deepest roots and one of the biggest branches that's still connected, that has never disconnected when you read the history, when you understand. We've never disconnected from the continent. It was a lie someone told that we completely was separated and lost every knowledge of ourselves. That is a lie. We'll put that myth to rest. Our Africanisms have survived until now. We can point them out in our music. We can point them out in our culture. We can point them out in our genetics. We can point them out in our language right now, today, all across the African diaspora. Meaning that the African diaspora are Africans, 100% Africans, no less African than those on the continent. We're Africans for the exact same reason as descendants of those who are indigenous to the African continent. Yeah, that's why we say race first, because if it's race first, then we can begin to see our people as one across and despite religious differences, across and despite national, geographical, cultural differences, linguistic differences. We'll begin to see ourselves as one African people, and we'll begin to develop a one African national interest, which will be global and inclusive of all branches of the African family. And so that is how I see it. Don't ever confuse the African diaspora for being a chopped off, separated, dead branch of the African family. It's impossible. If you ever see it like that, then you have believed a lie, and you really have to go back to your studies and research, understand cultural continuity. You have to understand the genetic survival, the survival of the African gene through it all. We say genocide. I mean, they tried to destroy a people, and we survived. Oh, very much so. And we're very diverse. We may be among the most diverse people on earth because in some circles, they tell you that linguistically, culturally, and biologically, genetically, African people are the most diverse people on the face of the earth. They will tell you that. But in all of African history, where do you have African people coming from as wide a range of regions as you have going to the Americas during the period of the Mansa transatlantic slave trade? Look at your history books. Show it to me. So these Africans were representing gene pools all over the continent, genetics from different groups all over the continent. And then they would be occupied to plantations. And those plantations, they would be confined to them like a prison. They would need a pass to leave the property, where it was limited. And they didn't get to choose who they made it with and what their bloodlines would become. And we mixed with ourselves. We mixed those African genes. And so we may be among the most diverse human beings on the face of the earth because of the fact of how much African genes are mixed within the African diaspora. You can take a DNA test today, and you can DNA test an African born here who doesn't have any ancestor who ever left during the transatlantic slave trade. Purely indigenous African on both sides of his family, right? Both sides of his lineage. And it'll come back in DNA result that this person is 100% whatever they are, right? Or whatever percentage they are, but it won't have any European mixture. It won't have any Native American mixture. And usually it won't have a Congolese and a West African Igbo mixture. It won't have decent mixtures because our people were relatively isolated from each other prior to the transatlantic slave trade and the colonization periods. Those periods brought a lot of our peoples into contact with each other under terms that we did not dictate for ourselves. And so the reality is that this admixture of cultures and genes and history and people, it all comes together to create this grand narrative, right? This big story. And you can't tell the story of humanity without telling this story, because we were there at the beginning and we are still here today. And people don't know how to put us into proper perspective. But if we're talking about genetics, we're talking about the most admixed Africans on the face of the earth when we're talking about the African diaspora. We're talking about people who have been forcefully admixed with outside groups due to the brutality of slavery and none other than that. And then we're also talking about admixture with the native indigenous peoples of the Americas, in part, at some point, especially very early on. As you know, there were African conquistadors. There were black conquistadors. There were black people who was there with Columbus. And so the black man and woman has always been present in the history of the conquest and the colonization of the Western Hemisphere. They haven't always been on the right side of history. You understand? But we've always been present. He was there. And so those genes was there. And so at some point, there was no woman being brought from Europe to be wives or provide children to the colonists. And they were taking local women. They were taking local women and doing their thing back then, you know? And so some of us, we still got those carried genetics from those early days in us because the large group descends from the small group. The large group descends from the small group, meaning that historically, we represent the multiplication of our ancestors as their descendants. They've multiplied genetically through us. There's more of us than there are them. And so we've increased in number. And genetically, that means that we've continued to admix. We've continued to fuse these different lineages, these different bloodlines. And yes, we represent a diverse African, a very, very genetically diverse and culturally and linguistically diverse African in the diaspora. But even with that, we're no less African than the Africans on the continent, especially when you understand that mixture that took place here. When you understand how the European mixed with African bloodlines here, and how the Arab has mixed with African bloodlines here, and how today you see the Lebanese and the Chinese and Indians mixing bloodlines in Africa here. You know, the same process, the same slavery and colonization came with this assault on African genetics. And so there's no way for Africans on the continent to look at the Africans in the diaspora and even say that genetically we're all too different. You know, we're a completely different species. We are the same people. We are one people. We are the Africans. We are the Africans. If there's Africans in this world, it's us.